Welcome to the Energy Show. I'm journalist Markham Hislop, and my guest today is Senator Paula Simons, who recently gave an excellent speech about Bill C-5, the Building Canada Act. We're going to talk about Bill C-5 as well as Alberta separatism and the provincial economy. So welcome to the interview, Paula.
Very nice to see you again, Markham.
Well, likewise, we haven't talked for a while, but this is the perfect way to have you back because C5 is getting more and more controversial. You were in the Senate, you had to debate it. Give us kind of your take on it.
Well, C-5, for people who, unlike you and me, have not been, obsessively following this, this is the One Canadian Economy Act, and it had two halves. So the first half is relatively non-controversial. This is the one that breaks down the remaining federal barriers to interprovincial trade and labor mobility. There weren't very many. I mean, most of these things are in the provincial ambit, but, so people liked the first half of C5. The second half of C5 is more problematic. This is the part that is designed to fast track environmental and other assessments of major projects that are deemed to be in the national interest. So project in the national interest, people in Ottawa are calling them ponies. So the idea is that you would get buy-in up front. You'd do a lot of pre-consultation, get everybody on the same page, and then you would go through the assessment process. So the promise to project proponents is that they're not going to get sandbagged at the end, and after 5 years of filling out forms and doing all the paperwork, they're then told, nope, sorry, there's no political appetite for this. So the idea is you establish the political appetite up front, you get buy-in from First Nations, Métis, Inuit, whoever are affected by that up front. You consult with the provinces, with the local municipality, the county, whomever, and then you go to assessment. And then the idea is you get a cleaner, faster process. The problem with this is, to my mind, a twofold one. What happens if you front end load the process and then you get halfway through the environmental assessment and people go, hey, actually, there's some orcas calving right there, or hey, there's a wildfowl nesting area for rare birds, and you're already in laser focused on getting things done. Can people then say, wait a minute, I know I agreed to this, but now I'm changing my mind? The other problem, maybe more subtle, is if you go into the assessment already, rooting for the project, in the bag for the project. Will that taint the assessment process, or will the assessment be, done properly? So that's some of the controversy around this. The part of the other controversy, though, frankly, has to do with process itself. There's a lot of language in the bill, in fairness, that talks about pre-fire, Indigenous consultation. The idea, sort of UNDRIP is in the background. There's a non-derogation clause that we've put in that says all legislation has to be respectful of, Indigenous and treaty rights. But I think a lot of leaders in the Indigenous community felt that the process was very rushed, that they were not sufficiently consulted about the drafting of the bill. And in the Senate, we felt things were rushed because we did not get the chance to study the bill properly by sending it to either the Energy and Environment Committee or the Indigenous Peoples Committee. We rushed it through with a few days of Committee of the Whole. And then I'm on my way to Stampede, which is why I'm wearing denim. But it's a little bit like, the cows got put in the chute and we were sent through the chute to do our job without a lot of opportunity to free range.
Very Alberta metaphor.
Very Alberta metaphor. As I say, I do not normally wear denim jackets, but I'm leaving you promptly to get in my car and drive to Stampede. So I'm looking the part.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Professor David Wright from the University of Calgary.
Yes.
And he had written a blog post about C5. You can go fast and make stuff, or you can go fast and break stuff.
Yeah.
And
I read that. I read that piece. Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of it?
Well, I mean, I think this is the crux of things. I mean, the idea of C5 is to fast track things. I mean, it's unapologetically about making things go faster. Sometimes when you take a shortcut, you end up taking you get lost. And I think one of the legitimate concerns about C5 is that if people think they're going fast and then there are legal challenges, or then there are major protests by Indigenous groups or environmental activists, you could actually not go faster. Sometimes sometimes, zipping through the steps means that, 2 years into the process, somebody says, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. You fast tracked this to such an extent that you overlooked really important legal or environmental or social concerns. And so I think for project proponents, we keep trying to fix the same problem. You and I talked a lot when I first became a senator about Bill C-69. And everybody hates Bill C-69 now in retrospect. But at the time, the whole point of Bill C-69 was to fix the problems with C of 2012. So, I mean, where proponents got sandbagged at the end of the process. So C-69 was supposed to get the buy-in up front, but it had so many steps. It had so many places where things could go off the rails. People don't feel that that's been a success. So C-5 is supposed to fix C-69, which was supposed to fix C of 2012. And at the end of the day, the problem is simple. If you don't have buy-in, you don't get a project. And rushing the process of buy-in, I'm not sure gives you the relationship of trust you need for people to say, yeah, you know what? There are environmental trade-offs, there are economic trade-offs. On balance, we think this will be worth the sacrifice.
Well, here's a take on this because let's say you go and get buy-in. Now, there's no way you can build a pipeline from Edmonton to Prince Rupert on the West Coast, which is what Alberta Premier Danielle Smith wants to
Well,
do.
I mean, the project proponents said themselves that environmentally and geographically, that was not a good plan. The
Okay,
people at the port of, yeah,
let's talk
I
about
think that's off. Yeah, I think that's
whether
off
it
the
goes to
table.
Kitimat, whether it goes to
Yeah,
Prince Rupert, it doesn't matter. Build another one to Vancouver, same problem, which is that in British Columbia, you're going to have significant opposition. And it's not a given that the BC government will be on board. David Eby has kind of been a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's hard to say. But when push comes to shove, my personal feeling is that he will oppose it. The problem here is that you even if you got through the front end of this, at the end, you still have Section 35 of the Constitution that says Aboriginal communities must be consulted. And if they don't meet the test, which nobody ever has the first time
yeah,
around, then you're back in court and then you're back doing it again
yeah,
anyway.
exactly. So, until we solve this problem of respect for Indigenous rights and Indigenous communities, nothing gets built. The other problem is, of course, that the Alberta government tends to make this all about pipelines. C-69 was not about pipelines, despite, then Premier Kenney's no more pipeline bill rhetoric. This is about all different kinds of projects. And I know that people in Alberta sometimes are very laser focused on one kind of project, but there are all kinds of ways that C-5 could benefit Alberta's economy and in Alberta's energy sector that don't involve, banging your head about building a pipeline that nobody wants to a place that it's not going to work. I just recently visited the Port of Vancouver and I actually watched I said, please take me to where the TMX pipeline spits out. So, I went in the little boat. I saw where the TMX ended. I literally watched them loading the barges with the oil. And one of the problems, people who know the Port of Vancouver better than I will know, that the Second Narrows Bridge, which goes over top, makes it difficult to take a big boat. So if you want to get more oil, Alberta oil to market, you could instead spend the money dredging under the bridge. You don't need to, the bridge is kind of magical and you don't probably want to go to the expense of building a new one. But if you dig out the goop at the bottom of the harbor, you can get, a bigger boat through. So that,
Well,
and then, and
VLCCs instead of an Aframax.
yeah, so, you can increase the potential for TMX to do what TMX was supposed to do by improving port facilities. Or what, for example, if you wanted to actually read the fine print of C-5, if you wanted a project that would be good for the grid to increase connections between Alberta and British Columbia, which would allow Alberta then to import more, quote unquote, green hydropower from British Columbia, which would give you, the stability of a baseload so that then you could go back to expanding solar and wind and have the hydro in your back pocket. Wouldn't it be good for Saskatchewan if it could have more access to Manitoba hydro? So it would be wonderful to see some private sector and public sector project proponents coming together to build a better integrated grid with less line loss so that, it's a more energy efficient grid and it gives us a greater diversity of electricity sources. Or there is, my pet project, which is kind of, it's probably a long shot. I don't think we have the population base to sustain it. The rational part of my brain knows this is silly, but the part of me that really likes trains would really like an Edmonton Calgary train. And maybe it could be, if not high speed, kind of medium fast speed. I'm about to get in my car and drive 3.5 boring hours to Calgary through inevitable construction and traffic jams. It would be great if I could get on a train. So there are all kinds of ways that we could imagine C-5 helping to build the Canadian economy and the Canadian energy sector. Suppose we had a hydrogen train from Edmonton to Calgary, which gave you a market for, for the blue hydrogen that Alberta is trying to produce.
You're involved in the energy debate at the national level. And so you have an insight into a question I'm always asking, which is why are we debating the wrong questions? Why are our energy discourse is so circumscribed? We talk about pipelines. We talk about LNG plants. We don't talk about the kind of things that you're talking about, and therefore we take projects off, we take visions of what our economy could be and our energy system could be. We just take it off the table.
Well, imagine I'm an energy company. Imagine I'm an electricity company and I think, right, there's going to be a market for wind and solar. So I'm going to go big on wind and solar. And then just imagine I'm working in a province where the provincial government decides one day to have a moratorium on wind and solar. I mean, so why would you, if you're an investor, put your money into something if you don't know that the market is going to be there and that the stability is going to be there? And part of the problem is that, the legacy players, some of whom I think are quite keen to diversify because they know the economics of this. They know that, if you get a whole summer where it's 45 degrees in Ottawa, people might come to the conclusion that perhaps we finally need to do something about this. But why would they take the chance of diversifying their portfolio if people keep changing the rules on them? So that's part of the problem. And part of the problem is that the legacy players who aren't interested in diversifying are terrified of change. And, why wouldn't they be? I mean, I represent Alberta. There are a lot of Albertans who work in the conventional energy sector. And, when the Trudeau government walked around prattling about one just transition, people were offended by that. And understandably, I mean, it was patronizing and it was demeaning. So we need to have an honest conversation about what an energy transition is going to look like. And we're going to need to demonstrate to people that there are going to be jobs and jobs that have, that you can go from one skill track to another. I mean, because telling people we're going to have jobs and they're all going to be, contracted out to AI is not helpful.
Paul, I'm going to push back a little bit on this because an honest conversation takes two honest parties who come in good faith. And I would argue that there are way too many parties in Alberta who are either bad faith debate or an uninformed debate, and people in the energy sector themselves. So, for example, I've interviewed, or gone to press conferences and asked questions of the premier about, energy modeling and what peak oil demand is, and they are all in on the OPEC vision of the future, which means 20 million barrels a day of growth between now and 2050. The IEA says all of that comes to a halt in 2029. Should we not at least consider alternate views of the energy future? And, like Mom said, hope for the best, plan for the worst. In Alberta, you plan for the best and to hell with the worst.
As an independent senator who is in the federal arena and not a member of any political party, it would perhaps ill behoove me to offer a detailed critique of provincial government policy as offered by Premier Danielle Smith. However, speaking in the larger picture, yes, of course it would. I mean, this is as simple as, eggs in a basket. You don't need to be a proponent or an opponent of supply management to know that if you put all your eggs in one basket and then you drop the basket, you have a problem. I mean, this is why, going back to the days of Peter Lougheed, a visionary Alberta leader who understood that part of planning for the future was to diversify Alberta's economy in all kinds of ways. I mean, Alberta can be an energy leader, and it doesn't have to be about putting, bitumen in pipes. And it could also be as simple as thinking about different ways to get bitumen to market. I mean, can you put it into pucks? I love the Canadian term for it. Can
PUX,
you
by the way.
Yeah, I mean, can you export bitumen in sort of solid form so that it's less problematic to ship it across the Pacific and worry about oil spills? There's also, we talked about why a pipeline to the west is probably not a great idea, but a pipeline east, remembering that our big pipeline east that carries Alberta oil to Ontario and Quebec flows through Michigan and was built in the 1960s. So, at a time when we're talking about national sovereignty and worrying about the impact of volatile American policies on the Canadian economy, you could perhaps make a case for a pipeline to go east, not even so much to increase, but to protect the access that we have. I mean, if somehow Line 5 got shut off, I think Ontario and Quebec would find it quite stimulating to realize that perhaps they do need access to Alberta oil if they want their economies to run. But I think the other question that we haven't touched on, people are acting as though C-5 is some kind of bag of money. I mean, Doug Ford compared Mark Carney to Santa Claus. C-5 doesn't have any funding attached to it. It is not a money bill. It
Right.
does not designate money for big public works. I mean, certainly the protocols of C-5 could make it easier to build things that are in, the public sector, whether that's through a port authority or an airport authority, but it's not a funding bill. So what C-5 is supposed to do is encourage private market capital to invest by telling them it will be easier to get a project greenlit. But no one's going to build if they think Alberta is going to have a tantrum and take all its oil and go home.
Right. But Prime Minister Mark Carney has hinted many times that he likes the American model that came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, where you use public capital to crowd in private capital. So while he hasn't said it specifically, he's certainly hinted that there would be Canadian public capital available to participate in projects. You can guess, like maybe a pipeline, maybe expanding a port, on the West Coast, whatever it might be.